He told her to leave because, in his words, she was not at his level. The restaurant tightened like a fist around that sentence. Hello, my family. May every woman here be surrounded by strength and dignity that no one can take away. She sat very still, the tablecloth cool under her fingers, while the chandeliers above them hummed and the murmurs of other diners moved like tide. He wore a suit that smelled faintly of cedar and new leather. She smelled lemon soap and the last of the wine on her lips. What no one in that room understood was what Emily had been building in silence for years. Stay with me, and you will see how public humiliation became a pivot that changed more than one life. The scene was the private dining room at Lumen, a restaurant known for polished silver and low conversation, in a neighborhood where glass towers cast long shadows at dusk. Daniel, her fiancé, spoke with a voice like a gavel. His tone had the brittle texture of someone who had been refined into certainty by money. Olivia, Emily's oldest friend, had come because she had insisted on moving seats to be closer. Around the table sat a handful of people who meant to witness an engagement that would cement Daniel's status. The lighting was warm, and the air tasted faintly of truffle and parsley. A server kept passing soups and then withdrawing, the silver clinking like small questions. Emily's hands felt slightly numb, the silk of her dress rubbing a smile that felt rehearsed and small. At the moment Daniel said, "You are not at my level," the silverware stopped. The room sounded like a shell. An assistant from Daniel's investment office looked down at her phone and then away as if the device had shown something unbearable. The first time we see Emily in memory, she is 7. Sitting on a stoop with scraped knees, waiting for a bus that never came. Her mother, a nurse who worked nights at St. Jude General, used to fold notes into pockets of her coat with simple advice. Be honest, be kind, and work like you do not need to prove anything. The smell of boiled eggs and coffee in the small kitchen, the texture of the quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, the rattling of pots at dawn were the lace of her childhood. School meant a second home because her mother could not afford endless sitters. Marcus, a high school teacher who would later become a small-town mentor, taught Emily how to balance numbers and expectations. He let her copy his textbooks and lent her outdated calculators. At 15, she learned to catalog library books, and that precise inventory could sometimes rescue a scholarship application. She studied architecture and then pivoted to real estate finance because she liked the way plans could promise more than one future. There was a loss in her 20s when her father, a machinist who loved maps and old jazz records, had a stroke. The hospital smell the day he left was antiseptic and sorrow. Emily found in work a place to keep her grief in order, and in volunteer shifts at a community center, a place to keep it human. Those years taught her the grammar of resilience, small acts repeated with stubborn care. A month before the engagement dinner, Emily had been approached by a small group of investors interested in a conservation redevelopment project she had been whispering about for years. Priya Verma, a former executive at a large development firm, called with rapid, efficient sentences and an accent that softened her authority. "We need projects that mean more than return," Priya said over a call that crackled with urgency and the hiss of a subway in the background. Thomas Reed, a boutique investor who managed family assets and had a reputation for patience, asked to see presentations with balance sheets and a social impact matrix. Sofia Alvarez, director of a neighborhood nonprofit, sent a note about available lots and the community's needs. Javier Morales, a corporate attorney, agreed to do initial paperwork. Emily moved forward quietly, holding meetings in cafes where she sketched plans on napkins and in the back rooms of libraries where the light was easier on tired eyes. Nobody in Daniel's orbit suspected the scale of the model she had built, the spreadsheets that implied not just profit, but repair. 2 days after the dinner and the humiliation, the external problem arrived like a phone call that set a different course. An article appeared online in a local financial blog, a tax lien discovered on a company that Daniel's family office was connected to, and rumors of a hostile auditor circling. The headline had the kind of teeth that could gnaw a reputation. Investment office under scrutiny as assets shift. Emily received a screenshot while packing leftovers into her bag. The laptop hummed like a distant engine. The risk was not only financial. If Daniel chose to publicize the gulf between their worlds, Emily's initiatives, which relied on quiet partnerships, could be endangered. "They can blow everything up if they trace this wrong," said Javier on a call, his voice low and pragmatic. "We need to control the narrative and secure our documents." A news segment that evening compounded the pressure. Cameras fold the light differently, and people with clipboards began asking names. The restaurant where the incident occurred was now a headline image, the sentence replayed, reframed, placed like a bruise over the story. The external threat demanded action. It demanded movement across a field Emily had been avoiding, the public. Emily decided to mobilize without spectacle. She knew how to gather a team that moved with purpose and discretion. First, she called Olivia, who had been a project manager on nonprofit builds and knew the logistical language of volunteers and timelines. "We need to confirm the community partners and lock the donors in," Emily said. Olivia's voice came through steady. Then she pulled in Marcus, who had tracked grant cycles and could forecast cash flows. Priya agreed to bring her network. Thomas said he would review investment allocations subject to due diligence, and Javier volunteered to sweep legal files for any vulnerability. The word team felt small when she said it out loud, so she kept calling them the cohort. They met in a windowless conference room above a bakery where the air still held traces of warm butter and caramel. They set a plan: secure key documents, prepare statements, align community leaders to speak about the project's purpose, and quietly notify a handful of trusted journalists whom Emily had met at conferences. She made a list of 20 people whose names she trusted to show up without curiosity but with purpose. "Not a spectacle," she emphasized. "We are showing the work, not the hurt." The first major public reversal happened on a Tuesday morning at the offices of the Grafton Institute, a civic forum that hosted leaders from business and culture. It was not a grand hall, but a room with floor-to-ceiling windows that smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the city's winter damp. Emily arrived with a presentation bound in a simple folder. The cohort had prepared, and 20 executives, including Priya and Thomas, and a handful of local funders were there, standing up as the projection screen clicked on. The scene that week would form the pivot that changed the narrative. Before the presentation, there was an exchange in the hallway that carried the electric quality of old grievances finding new light. Daniel, who had learned that Emily would have public attendees, tried to intervene. Their words were clipped. "Emily," Daniel said, voice taut with an anger that had been polished by privilege, "this is not how things work. You cannot drag this into the light." "This is exactly how things work," Emily replied. "People should see the plan. The community should be the first audience." "They will not see you how I see you," Daniel said. He reached out as if to take the folder back. "That is not your call," she answered, a quiet that was almost audible enough to cut. People in the corridor felt the tension like heat. Security glanced up. Olivia stepped between them with the practiced ease of someone who had mediated family fights before. Marcus came and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, a small gesture like a bookmark. Daniel turned and left. He muttered something that sounded like dismissal. The exchange had the rhythm of 11 short blows and replies that left the air tight, and an onlooker, Priya, later said she felt the room tilt into truth. The main presentation contained much more than a speech. The sensory details anchored each slide. Emily began by showing pictures of cracked sidewalks and boarded storefronts where children played next to construction dust. The projection gleamed with 2 bright lights, and the smell in the room changed, as someone opened a window and the scent of rain came in. She spoke about the textures of the neighborhood, the grit of old brick, the warmth of the corner bakery that offered free coffee on Mondays, the sound of a choir rehearsing in a church 2 blocks over. Her voice touched memory, not pity. The slides moved into the technical. There were projected cash flows, a proposed acquisition of 2 vacant parcels, a structure for an impact investing vehicle, and a plan to restructure local hiring practices so that a percentage of jobs would go to residents. Priya leaned forward and asked the first question with a sharp, useful kindness. "What will ensure long-term security for the project once assets transfer?" she asked. Emily pointed to a reserve account, explained governance through a community advisory board, and described an executive team model that mixed professional management with local mentorship roles. That exchange bloomed into a long dialogue, 11 back and forths, with concerns about returns, community rights, investor protections, and the day-to-day operations. Each time someone asked, there was a sensory anchor, a tapping pen, the cooling sip of coffee, a jacket sliding on the chair. By the end, Thomas stood and said, "I want to be part of this." And with that, the tone of the room changed from skepticism to devotion. The first moment of extended tension came mid-presentation when a journalist from a major outlet asked about Daniel's family office and the headlines. There was a pause that lasted long enough to taste the copper tang of anxiety. Emily kept her face steady and her words measured. "This project is separate," she said, "and it is driven by documented community needs and transparent governance." That reply led to a second wave of questions about funding sources that required Javier to pull out a folder of incorporation papers, tax filings, and letters from donors. He spoke in legal cadence and then simplified the jargon into everyday language, describing how assets would be ring-fenced and managed by an independent board. The tension loosened after 600 characters of exchange that read like a delicate chess match, where Emily and her cohort moved with quiet certainty and the onlookers shifted their position from doubt to investing curiosity. At roughly 1/3 of this story, we paused to draw the audience close and invite participation, because stories live when shared. If this part touches you, know you are not alone. Tell us briefly if you have ever seen someone underestimated in public. Type a line that starts with "I saw" and then the location. Posting this helps others feel seen and gives weight to how often humility is confused with weakness. Share one short memory. Your note could change how someone thinks about a neighbor or a coworker. After the Grafton reveal, the narrative moved fast. The cohort secured letters of intent from 3 impact investors and a pledge from Thomas for seed capital. Priya introduced Emily to a foundation that could provide an initial grant for community outreach. The press ran pieces that reframed the dinner incident. A particular op-ed by Rachel Hart, a columnist, used the phrase "not at my level" and then turned it on its head, narrating how public status had blinded onlookers to projects that mattered. The story grew legs. The second major public reversal came when 20 executives, many of whom were present at the Grafton meeting, arrived at Clemente Center, a neighborhood hall where Emily had been volunteering, to be introduced not to a pitch deck alone, but to people. The room smelled of cumin and coffee, walls covered with children's drawings. Hands met, palms were squeezed, and names were exchanged. They listened to Sophia, the local leader, describe job boards and mentoring sessions and the way the community garden fed 60 families. The executives were moved. Several took off their jackets and sat on folding chairs in a gesture that made the room quiet with surprise. This reversal was not theatrical. It was a slow removal of distance, a recognition born of direct sight. The climax of power reversal came when Daniel tried to approach the project with a press release meant to assert ownership. He issued a statement claiming that Emily had built plans on connections he had provided, and that he would escalate questions about funding. The cohort responded by releasing their own documentation and by inviting a panel of independent auditors to review the project's origins. The auditors found that Emily had sourced nearly 80% of the initial commitments independently, and that only a small advisory link had connected Daniel's office. When the report was public, the board of a related family foundation convened and discussed whether to support Daniel's claim. They declined. The public record recorded not only a correction, but a move to restructure responsibilities at Daniel's family office, because governance had been lax and reputational risk poorly managed. The language of the decision used the word restructure and of accountability. Daniel, who watched from behind a glass office window while city rain made streaks down the pane, learned in a way that no private rebuke could teach him that public pride had limits. There were several moments of private showdown where the consequences became visceral. One evening, in the months that followed, Daniel confronted Emily in a short, sharp exchange in a stairwell under fluorescent light. "You are making this personal," he hissed. "I will not be undermined." She replied in quiet, measured words that felt like ground braces. "I am not here to undermine you. I am here to make possible what should have been possible for the people who live here." The exchange was 600 characters of compressed emotion that included the sound of a distant elevator, the metallic touch of cold handrail under a palm, and the shabby smell of old paint. Privately, Daniel received legal notices from his own counsel about internal mismanagement, and that same week, his personal brand took a hit when clients started asking questions. The roar of gossip in the private clubs and at charity galas became a heavy sound he could not ignore. As the dust settled, consequences rippled. Emails circulated that showed investors reallocating commitments away from entities associated with Daniel. A memo went out to employees at his family office announcing a pause on certain client-facing activities while they undergo a governance review. Peers at elite dinners began to distance themselves. The sense of fall was not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but precise and procedural. Daniel moved into quiet, and in public he was the one who had to re-strategize. His social calendar thinned like a leaf burning. Within weeks, the once polished seat at certain boards was vacated. For Emily, the consequences were different. She experienced a surge of support from community members who had been waiting in line to name schools, to add jobs, to open kitchens. Her inbox filled with notes from young architects and financial analysts asking for mentorship. The change had a pragmatic cadence: new partnerships, new funding, new commitments to hire from the neighborhood. The technical steps that formalized the protection of Emily's project were methodical. The cohort created an impact vehicle structured as a limited liability entity with dedicated governance. They drafted covenants that legally ring-fenced assets and created a reserve fund for operational security. Investors signed term sheets that tied disbursements to milestones, and the Community Advisory Board was written into the bylaws to ensure local representation. This process used straightforward language about escrow, audit gates, and fusionary roles, and was executed with transparent timelines and independent oversight. Over the next months, Emily did not withdraw into triumph. She worked. She set up a small office above a thrift store and hired program coordinators from the neighborhood. She launched a mentoring program pairing retired professionals with local youth, and started a trades apprenticeship in partnership with a local technical school. The work was humble and precise. She taught young people to read blueprints and to imagine futures with actual plans. Marcus ran a weekend financial literacy class where the smell of chalk and hot chocolate filled the classroom. Each event had sensory anchor points that kept the work human. The rumble of a van delivering paint, the warm weight of a toolkit passed to a trainee, the taste of celebratory empanadas at a ribbon cutting. The journey of rebuilding was not only about buildings, but about habits. One afternoon, Emily sat with a teenage girl called Layla, who traced a table with fingers painted in acrylic and talked about how to get past fear. That conversation, small and tactile, had echo later when Layla was accepted to a vocational program. There were moments of tension, extended and internal, where Emily had to decide whether to accept a large offer that would have changed the governance structure in ways she considered harmful. Two investors proposed an acquisition, the project under terms that would have centralized control and reduced community seats. The negotiation that followed lasted long and was a pressure cooker. Emily and Priya argued over language. "You will strip out what we need," Emily said. "No," Priya replied. "We can preserve governance if we build the right covenants." They exchanged drafts and red lines, phone calls full of tapping, coffee sips, a stress headache behind the eyes. In those days, Emily turned to Olivia and Marcus for counsel. The tension peaked when a deadline loomed and the group had to decide: accept funding and compromise, or hold out for a structure that prioritized community voice. They chose the latter. The decision came after days of debate and 2 late-night meetings that smelled of cold pizza and fatigue. The outcome was 600 characters of careful negotiation and a victory that felt like a breath finally allowed. Another extended tension arrived when Daniel, attempting to pivot, launched a parallel philanthropic effort meant to rebrand his reputation. He offered large grants to educational programs, but tied them to naming rights and public endorsements. The community felt the sting of an offer that smelled like performance. The cohort had to respond not with anger, but with policy. They drafted a model policy for accepting gifts that protected mission and forbade manipulative public requirements. This required a public vote at the Community Advisory Board and a conversation that left members raw but clearer. The policy became a tool for accountability and required multiple rounds of edits and consultations. That process, detailed and procedural, took weeks and required patience. Among the quieter tensions, Emily had to reckon with her own sense of worth. The social humiliation had left a residue. She kept a journal and sometimes wrote in first-person lines that were private and sharp. In one entry she wrote, in a handwriting that trembled then steadied, "I do not need to be seen to be real, but I need to be seen so others can be safer." Those private sentences were a practice of rebuilding. She met with a mentor named Marcus on a rooftop with wind that smelled like the river, where they talked about legacy and limits. He said, "Legacy is not what you leave on a stone, Emily. It is the next life you make possible for someone you will never meet." As the project took shape, names started to matter differently. Priya led the investment committee. Thomas provided seed funding. Sophia organized hiring fairs. Javier handled legal filings. Olivia ran operations. Marcus led education programming. Each person contributed their expertise and became part of a web that balanced power. They were 7 pillars holding a small structure of possibility. They each found their own transformations. Priya, who had built a career on tough deals, wrote an op-ed about humility in investing. Thomas found that patience could yield impact. Sophia's nonprofit grew in enrollment. Javier discovered he liked pro bono work. Olivia learned to manage a staff with grace. Marcus returned to teaching with new resources. The reconstruction phase included a program that trained residents to bid on contracts for the construction phase, creating a pipeline of jobs. Emily instituted mentorship circles where each trades apprentice would meet a mentor once a week. The practical details of these programs were crafted in community meetings that smelled of coffee and laundry detergent, where people shared food and stories. The apprentices learned to measure, to set lines, to read a page of structural notes. They ate sandwiches on the job site and complained about tiny mistakes, which Emily learned to celebrate as learning. The epilogue unfolds in 3 moments that show time and transformation. At 1 month, the neighborhood saw a new sign go up outside a vacant building that read Community Work Center with a simple logo. The ribbon cutting was modest and full of faces. The mayor sent a short congratulatory video. Locals lined up with curious optimism. The center opened with an intake session and the smell of fresh paint. Volunteers recorded attendance and Emily walked through rooms that felt like breaths taken after a long run. There were names attached to the center: a class for welding, a class for bookkeeping, a room for youth art. A month was enough to make the work look possible and to gather the first real evidence that days of planning had a practical heartbeat. At 3 months, the project had placed its first cohort of trades apprentices on paid internships. The local bakery that had once given occasional jobs now provided formal apprenticeships. Wages met basic needs, and the cohort had enough money to pay for transit and to start small savings. The Community Advisory Board convened and approved a first set of outcomes: 30 jobs, 2 small businesses incubated, and a scheduled program for mentorship. The press documented the change. Daniel, who had once hosted parties that filled the society pages, found his invitations thinning and his attempts at public relations feeling like afterthoughts.
Emily's inbox filled with applications from young people across the city inspired by the story. Mentors signed up. The numbers became real with a spreadsheet that tracked attendance, retention, and job placement. The community felt protected by new governance and grateful for the practical dignity of work. At 6 months, the project had matured into an organization with a modest board, a reserve fund, and partnerships with 2 technical schools. The initial parcels had been acquired and the first phase of renovation had started. The community garden had been expanded and supplied by a small cooperative. A new clinic day offered basic health checks. The apprentices who had been hired received letters of recommendation that helped them apply for further training. The center served 300 families in its programs. Emily had become a recognizable figure in neighborhood meetings, but she had not become a celebrity. She kept her office above the thrift store and made time to meet every week with
the advisory board. Her work had turned routine into transformation. The impact was measurable. Unemployment for the neighborhood decreased, new small businesses opened, and community morale rose. At 6 months, Daniel had accepted a private role advising on governance reform and had begun an unpaid rotation at the center to understand community work. The change felt unfinished but proceeded with a steadiness that had weight. Through all this, there was an arc of redemption that was not a moral fairy tale but a disciplined practice. Daniel had to apply for a set of tasks to earn the community's trust back. He volunteered at the center, learned to do inventory and to work with the apprentices on simple tasks, and attended community meetings without a publicist. The condition of proof was humility and sustained service. He worked under supervision and contributed time, and the community measured his consistency. The story became one about how accountability can be taught and how public pride can be rebuilt into responsibility. The final moments of the story are reflective and action-oriented. The project now had an institute of learning attached to it where mentorship was formalized. Emily, who had been belittled in a public restaurant, had amassed partnerships with investors, a community advisory board, and a clear governance model that protected the mission. The legacy being built prioritized dignity and practical skills. The community gains were specific and tangible. Emily sat one evening under soft lamplight reading a note from a young woman who said she had found purpose and a paycheck that let her care for her mother. The sentence was simple and heavy. Thank you. The story asked us to hold 2 ideas at once, that people can be underestimated and still be powerful, and that those who have been hurt can choose a path of repair and leadership. If this story moved you, leave a short comment now. Tell us in one line if you have ever seen someone underestimated and where. It helps others feel less alone. If you want more stories like this, subscribe for narratives that reveal the work beneath the headlines. Join our community where we celebrate resilience, study the technical steps that sustain impact, and learn from leaders who mentor quietly. Together, we can hold accountable the idea that status equals value, and instead make room for lasting legacy built on humility and service. Thank you for staying with this story.